Hello, and thank you for joining us for another episode of the Hydrocarbon Engineering Podcast. I'm your host, Callum O'Reilly, and for our first episode of the year, I'm delighted to welcome back Alan Gelder, Senior Vice President of Refining, Chemicals and Oil Markets at Wood Mackenzie. Alan will help us review developments over the past year in the downstream sector and look ahead to what 2026 may bring. Our conversation follows on from a recent article that Alan prepared for the January 2026 issue of Hydrocarbon Engineering magazine, titled The Rollercoaster Ride of 25. Now, I'd encourage all of our listeners to read this article if you haven't done so already, and I'll be back at the end of the podcast with some more details on how you can do just that. Now, before we begin, a quick note that this episode was recorded at the end of January 2026. So let's talk to Alan.
This episode of the Hydrocarbon Engineering Podcast is sponsored by Rockwool Technical Insulation. Designed for durability and sustainability, Rockwool's high-performance stone wool insulation helps control process temperatures, reduce energy loss, mitigate corrosion under insulation, and enhance fire and acoustic protection. The result? Safer operations, improved asset integrity, and long-term performance across critical process industries. Learn more at www.rti.rockwool.com.
So hi Alan, welcome back to the Hydrocarbon Engineering Podcast. We're really delighted to have you join us once again to review downstream developments over the past year and to pick your brains on what we can expect in the year ahead. So thanks for joining us.
Callum, it's a pleasure. Thanks for the invitation. It's always interesting, isn't it, in terms of how the world continues to evolve quite quickly.
Yeah, I'm not really even sure where to begin this time, Alan. It's been quite some years. So when we spoke back in January 2025, there was a lot of uncertainty surrounding demand growth and what Trump's second term in office might look like for the sector. So you were also anticipating a tough year for refiners, but margins surprised to the upside. So were there any other unexpected outcomes? And can you give us a summary of your key takeaways from 2025?
2025, refining surprised us to the upside. Is probably, if I think across our view on oil markets, refining and chemicals, it was that refining jump to the upside. We were forecasting weaker oil prices as we went through 2025, largely because of supply growth outpacing demand growth. The good old Liberation Day tariffs and the tariffs that were imposed delivered that early, really, because it caused concern, consternation around demand growth. In hindsight, the economies were probably stronger than many feared as we went through 2025 because tariffs were paused. The pausing allowed manufacturing to reschedule, get ahead of the trade tariffs. And then we got to the second half of the year. There was a raft of things that supported the refining sector, really around diesel, distillate shortage. We had demand growth relatively modest. We had change in the ECA regulations around bunker fuels in the Mediterranean that supported gas oil. But the main thing was around Ukrainian drone strikes on Russian refineries, because at certain points during September, October, there was about 1.5 million barrels a day of Russian refining capacity was out of operation. And that just tightened the global diesel market. And then we had sort of sanctions on Rosneft and Lukoil, which caused people to get concerned about which Russian crudes they could process. And then there was the EU legislation around products imported to Europe must not be from Russian crude. And the way you proved that was 60 days not processing Russian crude before the export cargo, which meant that kicked in towards the end of last year, which again just drove diesel prices quite high. And so we had a refining industry in the second half of the year had a very strong year, more driven by supply loss than strong demand. Oil market did broadly as we expected, sort of weakened. Chems was quite ugly, really.
Yeah, so I was going to mention, Alan, you mentioned in your recent article that features in the January issue of Hydrocarbon Engineering that the global refining sector will look back on 2025 with fondness. But can the same be said for the petrochemical sector?
No, they had an awful year last year. Steam cracker margins were very, very weak. Utilization was low. There were closure announcements, effectively. Facilities in Italy, facilities in Germany, and also Mossmoran in Scotland announcing they're going to close in 2026. So it was very much a year of very difficult news for many of the facilities in Europe. So very, very different picture for the petrochemical sector compared to the refining sector in margin terms and in terms of the number of sites that are being closed and probably remain under threat of closure.
So, Alan, you already have touched upon the Liberation Day tariff. So let's dive into those a little bit more. How did they immediately impact the sector, and how will they continue to do so into this year and beyond? We've seen in recent weeks that with the evolving situation in Greenland, additional tariffs never seem to be completely off the table with the current US administration. So how much consternation is this causing in the downstream sector?
Well, firstly, it makes trade very difficult because you never quite know the cost of what you're buying. Energy largely is exempt, though, in terms of those trade tariffs, but they basically are impacting the global economy where people are able to source materials from, the overall cost. So it just adds a huge layer of uncertainty. It adds a huge layer of complexity, uncertainty, and they seem to be part of a general US policy. We're towards the end of January, and soon the US Supreme Court is supposed to provide some opinion as to the validity of what the Trump administration has done. If they go against that, probably doesn't mean the tariffs go away. They'll come back in some form, but it just adds complexity, uncertainty. So anybody buying equipment, it's very difficult and very challenging. You just think of the refining sector in terms of all of the things that are bought and procured and used as we go through the maintenance and projects and turnarounds. It just makes budgeting and planning really quite complex. And it's one of the drivers for us as to why we're expecting global oil demand growth for this year to be low and even lower than what we had last year, because our economists, you can almost call them traditionalists, they believe that the tariffs ultimately get paid by the consumer, so that reduces their spending elsewhere, and they're gritting the wheels of global trade, so it just slows things down. So it just means actually for us, GDP growth for 2026 is going to be weaker than 2025, and our oil demand growth is relatively low. It's between 600, 700,000 barrels a day. So we're quite low this year, and that just puts sort of downward pressure on oil prices, but also it just limits sort of refining margins as well if there's demand weakness for the products that the sector is producing.
Yeah, so moving on to refining, Alan, what is the broad outlook for the sector in 2026? And will recent developments in Venezuela have any material impact with the prospect of heavy crude flowing into Gulf Coast refineries?
So aggregate global level view is that we're expecting 2026 to be the low point for global refining margins going forward. And there's a couple of reasons why. We've touched on one already in that we've got relatively weak oil demand growth this year. We've also got a number of projects that are being completed in Q1, a big chunk of them, one or two in China, big chunk in India. The evidence to date is that those refineries are largely completing to time, and their commissioning is going well because they're largely being built by existing refiners, expansions or additions. We're also expecting the Dos Bocas facility in Mexico is ramping up slowly, and we're expecting Dangote, the issues with the RFCC, to get fixed. So we've got a year of weak demand growth and capacity coming on, which actually suggests to us that the tightness that we saw in the second half of last year kind of eases. So margins are then relatively weaker in 26 and 25. And then as we go forwards, things start to improve because there's not much more capacity additions coming on. And we've still got a world of continued global oil demand growth, in which case the existing refining system needs to work a little bit harder, which is just a bit more supportive. The big uncertainties for the refining sector is just, it's around Russian export of crude and how that works. But you come down to the geopolitics uncertainties around the Russia-Ukraine conflict, and that's around sanctions on what is flowing out of Russia, and also how effective the Ukrainians are in sort of impacting, damaging the Russian refineries. That could provide upside to our view. Venezuela is a fascinating one because it's changing quite quickly. So at the moment, towards the end of January, using the vessel tracking and cargo tracking that we have, what's coming out of Venezuela is actually a bit lower than what it was before the blockade was imposed towards middle of December. And that's because 600 kbd used to go to China, often to the independent teapots. That's largely stopped because that was mainly shadow fleet, dark fleet vessels that are choosing not to run the blockade. And so what we're seeing is exports dropping. There's always been exports to the US Gulf Coast because Chevron had a waiver. They've now got Vitol, Trafigura acting on behalf of the US authorities. They're trying to facilitate and market the crude globally. We're seeing more volumes than what previously Chevron was taking flowing out of the US Gulf Coast, but the aggregate is down. It's going to sort of Caribbean islands, so we're expecting some of it to be reverse lighted to put onto VLCCs and shipped to India and perhaps the state-owned enterprises in China. But at the moment, Venezuela production is down prior to December, but we're expecting it to recover as that offtake gets more formalized. You find different groups of buyers. What that should do is then be able to deliver more heavy sour crudes into the US Gulf Coast and other markets. And so that will benefit US Gulf Coast refiners because their crude diet could be much heavier than what they've previously been running because there's been a shortage of heavy crudes because the Venezuelan production's been down. It's also not been permitted to go to the US. We've seen lower volumes come out of Mexico because production is declining, and also Dos Bocas has ramped up, and that's been replaced to some degree by Canada. But there's still not as much heavy oil being processed in the Gulf Coast as they've done in the past. So it's an opportunity for the US Gulf Coast refiners. But if we think back, there were significant volumes of Venezuelan crude that used to go to places, go to India, because the way they valued it. So we're expecting that flow to be reestablished. We're also seeing lots of interest from some of the oil field services companies and some of the private sector companies in the US to go in and rehabilitate the upstream sector. We think there's a period of a couple of months while things stabilize. The hydrocarbon law is being amended in Venezuela. So we're expecting Venezuelan production to creep up. So if we take the end of 2025 was say about 850,000 barrels a day, probably by the end of 27, it'll be over 1 million barrels a day. So it's 200,000 to 300,000 barrel a day increase. Big chunk of that will go to the US. A big chunk will go elsewhere. So that will benefit the global refining sector because they will see more crude that they're configured for. But we're not expecting a significant ramp up of Venezuelan production anytime soon because the fiscal regime needs to change. The country needs to be stable. The oil majors need to be confident that they can invest and not have expropriation again. We think that takes a lot of time. Chevron will be the one, and Repsol, who are operations there, that probably be the quickest to respond. But the challenge for some of the US heavy oil fields is, under our understanding of the current fiscal regime, they need high oil prices to make them economic. So the fiscal regime needs to change. People need to be comfortable that's sustainable, and they need to be comfortable they can make significant investments that will take many years to come to fruition. And we think that that's unlikely to be quickly. So that's something that we're working on. We think it's a number of years before we get materially higher volumes out of Venezuela. The other thing where people will understand once they get people on the ground is what state of repair are the existing facilities in, how much needs to be done just to rehabilitate what's already been there, because Venezuela's not had access to US dollars for a couple of years now. And so our understanding is lots of kit has been cannibalized, which means things just need to be replaced just to provide a stable foundation. So that'll become clear over the next couple of months.
And petrochemicals in 2026, capacity growth continuing to outpace demand?
The thesis we have, the China investment wave continues. And so we're looking at Chinese capacity additions over the next couple of years, again, that largely outpace global demand growth, which means we've got continued rationalization of closure of assets in Europe, some in China, the older facilities, but also less competitive sites in Southeast Asia as well. So the environment stays challenged for the next few years. What we are hoping for, or our view is that the Chinese 15th five-year plan, when it's announced, moves away from commodity chemicals. because the 14th one largely drove this investment plan. But think of our outlook now, a lot of companies' investments are being delayed and paused because margins are being so weak, but they're not being cancelled. They're just not rushing to do a project that's going to be challenging economics-wise. We think we're expecting China to change its investment focus for the next 5-year plan, in which case it'll move more towards specialities, in which case global demand growth for petrochemicals will then start to erode this overhang that we've got. It's towards the end of this decade. It's going to be a very difficult period for the next couple of years. And that's why we're seeing actions like SABIC effectively leaving Europe, because the market is not going to solve the challenge we've seen very quickly. So people have to work out how they can deal with the current financial situation if it stays for a number of years, which is prompting some of these closure decisions. It's a difficult place.
So, Alan, your article that featured in Hydrocarbon Engineering included a list of key things to watch out for in 2026, one of which was rising tensions in Venezuela. Now, there's obviously been some significant development.
Got that one. I was going to say we kind of got that one right, but that was when it was written and there was a naval blockade being put into place.
That's it. And yeah, that's typical, Alan, that you would put that together and then a couple of weeks later, things really moved. But what else should we be considering in the year ahead? Lots of eyes on Iran at the moment?
Yes. We'd love to know what President Trump was going to do and when he was going to do it. I'm sure everybody would do that because we're dealing in a wonderfully unpredictable world. End of January, probably the concern the oil market is looking at the moment mostly is around Iran. What happens there? The protests seem to have largely stopped from what we understand, though news flow is fairly limited. But the US has a carrier group off the Indian Ocean that's well within striking distance. Will that just stay there? What will that do? Will they start to follow what they did against Venezuela and start to impose a blockade on Shadow Fleet? Or is it just purely there just in case? So there's an awful lot of uncertainty around the political situation in Iran, whether the role of the US, say Israel, whether they'll strike the facilities. I think it's going to be much harder to decapitate the Iranian regime compared to, say, the Venezuelan regime. But there's an awful, but just given the nature, the significantly larger production, the Straits of Hormuz, the ability or the threats that would go along if Iran was attacked, it just adds a layer of uncertainty there. So it's really what are the US policy requirements that could come into play this year? Does peace break out between Russia and Ukraine? Because now there's currently negotiations in the UAE. Could that be a viable source? In which case, sanctions on Russia may well ease. Yeah, they may well tighten initially and then could ease. So again, that could change how Russian volumes are treated and considered. The big uncertainties for us are global GDP growth and what that does for oil demand, and then the geopolitics around supply loss. Is that supply is lost through Ukrainians hitting Russian export infrastructure and Russian refineries, or does supply come roaring back if a peace agreement is reached that everybody is comfortable with, and all of a sudden the US sanctions are eased and lifted? It's those wonderful geopolitical aspects, and there's probably a raft of things we have not thought of, and that's that's often the Monday morning challenge, given a lot of what the US administration does tends to be over the weekend when the markets are closed. My hope for this year was 2026 would be quieter. It's proven not to be so far. It certainly hasn't started off that way. So my hopes for a quiet year have faded. I remain hopeful, but I've not done too well so far in this month. No.
So finally, Alan, your article for Hydrocarbon Engineering concludes by suggesting that market participants should plan cautiously in the year ahead as the dynamics of surplus against, or they suggest lower oil prices in combination with weak refining and petrochemical margins. So what would be your key piece of advice to our listeners going into the new year?
It is remain cautious. Things may well, in terms of margins and oil prices, may well do better than we're modelling because of supply loss and the geopolitics. So there's the element of being cautious. We're looking at a world where international rules don't seem to be respected to perhaps the same degrees they were. Probably a larger theme, though, actually, and it it's easy to say but difficult to do, is to probably look through the events we're looking at 26 into 27, 28 and beyond, because despite all of these headwinds that we've got in the global economy, which are largely geopolitical related, we're still seeing demand growth. That demand growth will need to be satisfied. There will be the opportunities for investments in the sector, and that depends on where they are. Competitive assets, capacity could be grown. We've still got an energy transition underway. There's still going to be growing demand for liquid renewables, which will provide opportunities for others. So those overarching themes still remain. We're seeing the energy transition, probably that transition be a little bit slower, particularly in the US, but it continues to happen in China and Europe to a degree. That challenges some of the fossil activities, but gives opportunities elsewhere in co-processing liquid renewables or converting to bioplants. Be cautious, but also establish those long-term trends that are happening despite current events, and see if there's an opportunity there to not be missed, because those fundamentals, the world is turning and continuing to evolve, and just need to be conscious of that and not be surprised when we come out the other side.
Thanks, Alan. I think that's really sound advice. As always, a real pleasure to have you on the podcast and to capture your thoughts on what's in store for us in the year ahead, even if it's a tricky environment in which to be doing so. So really interesting stuff, a lot to keep an eye on. So thank you very much, Alan.
Callum, pleasure. Don't hold me to what I've said too much. If we do this in 27, we'll find out how the world did play out.
We'll get you back on in a year, Alan, and we'll see how you did.
I look forward to that, though. Yeah, thanks.
Great. Thanks, Alan. So that wraps up our conversation with Alan Gelder from Wood Mackenzie. A timely look at the key developments that defined the downstream sector in 2025 and what companies should be preparing for in the year ahead. Now, if you'd like to take a deeper dive into Alan's thoughts, you can access his article from the January 2026 issue of Hydrocarbon Engineering now. If you already have a subscription to Hydrocarbon Engineering, simply log into your account over at our website, hydrocarbonengineering.com. And if you don't, you can pick up a free trial subscription to Hydrocarbon Engineering magazine now by visiting hydrocarbonengineering.com/magazine and following the simple on-screen instructions. Thank you for listening, and if you found this episode useful, make sure to subscribe and join us for the next conversation.
This episode of the Hydrocarbon Engineering Podcast is sponsored by Rockwool Technical Insulation. Designed for durability and sustainability, Rockwool's high-performance stone wool insulation helps control process temperatures, reduce energy loss, mitigate corrosion under insulation, and enhance fire and acoustic protection. The result? Safer operations, improved asset integrity, and long-term performance across critical process industries. Learn more at www.rti.rockwool.com.